All right, so, hey, I've got an intro for our friends Joe and Ash here. So, and I say Joe before Ash because Joe's sitting right next to me, but alphabetically it's Ash and Joe. So as many of you are probably aware, the question of how to include transgender and non-binary youth in our schools has been a growing and at times hotly debated question in our schools here in Wisconsin, in our legislature, as well as across our state, as well as our country. At the national level, we saw the issuance of guidelines a couple of years ago from the Obama-era Department of Education on how to support and include trans youth in schools. This guidance, painted as radical and dangerous by some, and also welcomed with great joy by many, pulled from the collective wisdom of individual educators, school districts, and states who had already been working many times for years to support and include trans and non-binary youth without causing the sky to fall, which often is the concern when people talk about how do we support and include. Some of that wisdom came from school districts right here in Wisconsin, including from some school districts that are here with us today, including the Shorewood School District, which I think they're in the room, there they are. So, as well as the Madison School District, so, as well as others, of course. So shout out to Shorewood, Madison, and other school districts who've been getting it right, or working on getting it right for a while. The Obama-era guidance provided a clear and much-needed roadmap for districts around the country to engage in consistent, fair, and affirming practices that support all students in our schools. If followed, the guidance greatly reduced the chance, or the game of chance trans youth often had to play by greatly increasing the likelihood that they would be supported consistently by every educator throughout the day. It wasn't perfect, but it was a great roadmap, and it was a great step forward. Unfortunately, one of the first actions of the Trump administration was to rescind this guidance. This action threw a big pile of confusion into what can be a confusing situation for school districts unaware of best practices. And sure enough, some districts are now confused about what they can do, what they should do, and what they must do. And as a result, at gsafe, we've definitely encountered some educators that believe it would be illegal for them to simply call, for instance, a transgender student by the name and pronouns they prefer, among other things. So there's a concern that the rescinding of the guidance actually made it illegal to support trans youth. And the answer is you should and still support trans youth, but Joe and Ash might talk about that in certain ways in a moment. Anyway, so here in Wisconsin, we continue to be one of the last Midwestern states to not include specific protections for transgender and non-binary youth in our statewide non-discrimination laws. Since 2005, gsafe has been working with students, families, and educators to change that, working to change local policy one district at a time. And so just to give some context, back in 2005, there were absolutely zero Wisconsin school districts with any type of specific protections for trans and non-binary youth in our schools. And at last count, and I think the number is higher, but we need a volunteer to help us do some counting. So hit me up if you like tracking down school district websites. But at last count, there were 229 districts with those protections covering close to, yeah. And those districts cover close to about 75% of students in Wisconsin schools. So we're still not there, but we're getting closer. But as we found, just because a district has, my butt's still talking, so sorry. I'm gonna turn that down. But as we found, just because a district has policy, that doesn't guarantee that they know and understand what best practices look, sound, and feel like for our students and their families. There are still districts here that either don't see the need to work towards full inclusion of their trans and non-binary youth, despite the growing body of evidence, including the lived lives of the young people who are saying we need your support. Despite the growing body of evidence that taking simple steps to support this youth population not only drastically improves their health outcomes, but it also improves school climate for all students. It's a win-win when we work to support our trans and non-binary students. And there are unfortunately some districts, despite the best efforts of individual educators to the contrary, that dig in their heels and simply refuse to provide our trans and non-binary students with basic dignity and respect. Fortunately, more and more students are finding the support and strength they need to push back when this happens, which leads to our two speakers. I don't want to tell their story for them, but I do want to appreciate both Ash and Joe for taking the time to be here with us today. Ash Whitaker, a graduate of the Kenosha Unified School District and current UW-Madison sophomore. who's joining us from Madison today, and then Joe Wardensky, did I say your name right?
You did.
So, a civil rights attorney at Dane and Colfax, PLLC in DC. So thank you for flying in from DC to join us this morning. They did something pretty incredible. They took on a school district that had dug in its heels, refusing to see and include Ash in all aspects of his school community. They're here to talk about that struggle, how things went, and what the results of their case have on schools and communities here in Wisconsin. So I really want to give another round of welcome to Ash and Joe. So I told Ash and Joe I have some really great questions for them, starting with, so Ash and Joe, tell me, what happened and why was it not okay?
Hello, is this on? Okay. So what really started it, I guess, there were two incidents that kind of happened generally at the same time. One was I decided to run for prom court at the urging of some friends, and I was denied by the principal. And then the second instance was I was using the men's restroom, and a teacher from early on in high school, before I had transitioned, came in, saw me, and posed a innocent question to the administration, and then the administration blew it up from there into what most people now know of my case. If you want to take over maybe on the legal aspect of that a little bit.
Sure.
Oh, it has a moment delay.
Yeah.
Sure, I'll talk a little bit more about it, but I want Ash to tell more of his story too. Before I talk about the case, I want to also say that I wear another hat, something with what Brian had just said, which is before I started my current job and started having the real privilege of working on Ash's case, I was at the Justice Department in the Civil Rights Division's education section, and was involved in the first Title IX enforcement case ever on behalf of a transgender student who was discriminated against in the Arcadia School District in California. And was also involved in writing the guidance that is no longer in force, but I definitely think it's still a good roadmap to schools who want to use that document as a tool for treating trans kids as they should be treated. The rule is pretty simple, and the settlement that we reached with the Arcadia School District now back in, I think it was 2013, was that it was a middle school trans student, a trans boy. He was denied access to bathrooms and everything. And eventually the school district agreed to treat him as a boy in all respects for the rest of his time in school, period. And that really is the best practice, right? To treat trans kids as the sex they are and know themselves to be, period. So Kenosha didn't do that, and all of that happened your junior year, right, Ash?
Yeah. So this was junior year prom, and some of the events that occurred following like these initial instances were of the nature like I was getting pulled out of classes, I was getting lectured by administrators, I was being timed on when I went to the restroom, and it's in all of the public documents. We found it in discovery, like it was written down. There were these stickers that were originally presented as wristbands to me and my mom, and they were almost distributed to trans students to identify them, to make sure students are going in the right bathroom. My mom received a school-wide email that all of the other teachers got that said, if you see any students going into bathrooms they shouldn't be going in, please report it. And because my mom worked at my high school, everyone knew who they were talking about. So it was really, the end of my junior year was really like, I think, a semester long of feeling like I was targeted by the administration of my high school and of the school district. And so it kind of bled over into my senior year when some of the decisions started coming in more and more. And going into my senior year with all of like winning the cases at their checkpoints with the preliminary injunction, which protected me to use the restroom for the remainder of my high school career temporarily until we furthered the case. And then I ended my senior year with winning 7th Circuit, I believe, and it was definitely a good note to go to college on. But yeah, it was definitely really difficult as a student because it feels like at some points your age is used against you and the things you know and the things you feel. And it seems like it was really easy for some adults to dismiss some of my concerns because I was a teenager and because they're like, oh, you're just hormones and teenagers and being emotional. And it was, it did escalate to the place it did, 7th Circuit, partially because of that, partially because, like Brian had said, Kenosha was really, really digging in its heels against me. They've ignored other discrimination instances in the past as well. This is just the one that got brought forward. So I also want to make note, like, I'm not the only student that was discriminated against by KUSD. And if anyone's seen the news in the past few months, it hasn't really stopped and it's been kind of going on for a while. I'm glad that it was brought to light because of this case.
So I will talk a little bit more about the case. Ash told you about his junior year and just how terrible it was on a daily basis, that the options that Tremper High School gave to Ash were you can either use the girls' restrooms or one of these so-called gender-neutral restrooms that we're creating just for you and giving you a key so no other student can use them. They're 10 minutes away from your classes, and you'll be calling yourself out by going into these restrooms that no one else can use. Have fun, right? And so, Ash, I don't think you ever use those restrooms, right? Right. And so instead, Ash, like, you know, a lot of kids in this situation try not to use the bathroom at all, and that has pretty terrible consequences no matter who you are, and both physical and emotional. And when we came on board, which is June, right as your junior year was ending, we were looking ahead to the senior year, and that if this continued, potentially your whole life would be affected, because this is the year that you want to enjoy your senior year, to apply for colleges, to, you know, focus on your classes and focus on being a senior in high school, not on sort of being watched by school administrators and security guards. And Ash is right, we literally found handwritten logs of, you know, went in at 1:08, came out at 1:10, and, you know, things like that were going directly to the administrators whenever anyone saw Ash use a restroom. So the Transgender Law Center got involved on Ash's behalf and sent a letter to the school district at the end of his junior year saying this violates the law. At the time, the federal government agreed, and some courts had agreed so far, and stop, you know, you need to treat him correctly, and we're happy to work with you to help you do that. gsafe had also reached out and offered, in the way that you do.
Yeah, and it was a very nice, like, thank you for reaching out to us email, so
right.
Then never heard from them. Yep.
So the school district wrote back saying, no, we don't have to do anything, and we're not going to. So that was the invitation to file a lawsuit. That's when my firm and I got involved, and we filed a lawsuit in July of 2016, and we also moved at the same time for a preliminary injunction, which Ash mentioned, that would strike down the school, would ban the school district from enforcing any rule against Ash that would require him to use any restrooms other than the boys' restrooms, and to otherwise treat him as a boy during his senior year. Because there was other things like overnight accommodations on, band, orchestra trips and field trips and things like that. This was sort of a nonstop, series of things. So we filed a lawsuit, a federal lawsuit in Milwaukee. The Judge Pepper, had a hearing in September of Ash's senior year, and just a couple weeks later, sort of in very quick time for litigation, issued this injunction saying that Kenosha had to treat Ash properly for the rest of the school year. And that was the victory that counted, because that allowed Ash to go and focus on his senior year, and that injunction was in place until the very end of the school year. The school district appealed it, they appealed it to the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, and the Seventh Circuit had not decided this issue before. In fact, no federal appeals court had decided this issue before about whether Title IX, which prohibits sex discrimination in education, and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which also prohibits sex discrimination and other forms of discrimination, do those apply to trans people and trans students in this case in particular? Other courts had held that employees are protected by sex discrimination laws in employment discrimination cases and other contexts, but no court had yet reached this question in the school's context. Gavin Graham's case was going along at about the same time.
Could you give a little context for Gavin Graham?
Yeah. So if you haven't heard of Gavin Graham, he is a graduate of a high school in Gloucester, Virginia, a trans student whose case is actually still going on, unfortunately. Almost made it to the Supreme Court, but he unfortunately was never able to use the boys' restrooms at school because of a similar school district that has decided to fight it tooth and nail along the way rather than just treating, doing the easiest thing, which is just to respect the student for who he is. So the case went to the Seventh Circuit. I had the privilege of arguing the case in March of 2017, and we got a unanimous decision 5 days before Ash's graduation that affirmed the injunction and said that Title IX prohibits discrimination against transgender students, that if you treat a transgender student differently from other students, whether for bathroom access or otherwise, that's sex discrimination, and that the school district also showed no reason that would, basically that the policy was also unconstitutional because the Kenosha had failed to give any good reason why it was discriminating against trans students in this way. And so Ash then graduated. The Washington Post, the day of your graduation, ran an editorial with the headline, "Mr. Whitaker can graduate with pride," congratulating him for his perseverance in advocating for himself. The district sought to have the case go to the Supreme Court, and we ended up settling the case and got a wonderful settlement for Ash, which allowed him to put the case behind him and actually just be a college kid. So that's the sort of quick and dirty about the case, but happy to answer lots more questions.
You had mentioned the Gavin Graham case, and I was going to ask about that and how that was, your case was different from the Gavin Graham case, particularly what you saw as different between the two cases, if there was a difference in approach or if it was just simply a difference in location or the particular circuit court.
So Gavin Graham's case, the facts were basically identical. He transitioned, he started using boys' restrooms for a short amount of time. In his case, the school administrators were actually supportive, but once some parents got wind of it, they went to the school board, and the school board had a very public meeting singling Gavin out very publicly as a sophomore or freshman in high school, and passed this policy that a formal written policy, which Kenosha actually didn't have, that said that restrooms and locker rooms at school, your access is governed by the sex on your original birth certificate or something like that, or maybe they might have actually said biological sex and they didn't define that, and so that's it's another question of what that actually means these days. But at any rate, they lost in the district court. They had a conservative district court judge and lost, and then appealed it up to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. The Fourth Circuit ruled Gavin's way, but they did it in a different way than they did in Ash's case, which is, at the time, the federal government had had issued this guidance and had taken the position that Title IX protects trans kids from discrimination at school. And so what the court did, they deferred to that guidance, but they didn't do their own interpretation. They just said, under this doctrine of sort of deferring to federal administrative agencies and interpreting federal laws, we're going to leave it at that, but we're not going to reach the question of whether Title IX actually, if we were to go through the analysis, whether we would reach the same conclusion. That case then went to the Supreme Court, which sent it back. They scheduled an oral argument, and the case almost went up, actually right before Ash's case was argued in the Seventh Circuit. And then because the Trump administration had withdrawn the guidance, the Supreme Court basically decided the question was moot and sent it all the way back down to the district court to start over again. And so that's basically where that case is now.
So thinking about the case, what does that mean for Wisconsin school districts? So what's the big whoop about it? So yeah.
There it is. So I think one of the biggest things with this case is precedence. So my case was on an individual basis. This case was for me and for the discrimination I faced. However, I don't know how likely it is for most school districts to approach those situations again if there's another trans student and they're like, let's say no again. I don't see that being as likely. It does still happen, but it does set a precedence that, you know, if you discriminate against students based on their gender identity, one, they're probably not going to go quietly into the night, but also they, you know, it's just blatant discrimination, and I think it almost makes it worse because it's to children, and it's for things they don't know / can't control about themselves. And you know, in environments when you need to engender creativity and uniqueness and diversity, boxing people in based on their gender is not a far cry away from what happens to people of color, especially queer people of color, in schools. So I think this is a good step to defending queer people in, you know, educational settings, but I also do think there's more we could do.
Yeah.
Especially
That's a
across
follow-up
the
question. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, so you know, I echo what Ash said about the precedent that his decision set. Because it went all the way to the Court of Appeals, the Seventh Circuit, you know, that's the level that's just below the Supreme Court. And when they issue a decision, that becomes the law of the region for which that, you know, that court covers. So the Seventh Circuit is the Court of Appeals for Wisconsin, Illinois, and Indiana. And so when they wrote in their decision that, and I'm reading a quote here, a policy that requires an individual to use a bathroom that does not conform to his or her gender identity punishes that individual for his or her gender nonconformance, which in turn violates Title IX. Kenosha's policy subjects Ash as a transgender student to different rules, sanctions, and treatment than non-transgender students in violation of Title IX. And they also said that simply providing a gender-neutral alternative wasn't enough. Because it was the policy itself that violated Title IX by making distinctions between transgender and non-transgender students. So that's the law in the Seventh Circuit. I think it's the law across the country, but the Seventh Circuit has made crystal clear that Title IX and the constitutional protections against discrimination apply to trans kids. And that's the rule that every school district in these 3 states must follow without facing legal liability. And that's the real impact of Ash's case, in advancing the ball both for trans kids but also for trans people more generally, because when you're looking at civil rights laws that protect trans people, other sex discrimination laws in employment and healthcare, courts will look to that decision and have looked at that decision to say sex discrimination against trans people is sex discrimination. I'll talk about, if we have some time, maybe another case later, but that's the impact of this case. It was huge. And other courts are now looking at the Whitaker decision and citing it all the time when they rule the right way for trans people in other places.
Well, and that's really, thank you. It's really interesting for me because I think about how that impacts, you know, sometimes around bathrooms and locker rooms or whatever else have you, people are like, oh, that's clearly discrimination, or people like, you know, or get really confused about that. But we also have there's a lot of school districts, or actually a growing number of school districts in Wisconsin that have not just policies that say we're not going to discriminate, but then they also go on to provide guidance or procedures around that says, here's how we're going to do that around names, pronouns, privacy, field trips, etc. And there's one interesting one that keeps coming up when I'm working with school districts, including here in Janesville, where they have guidance procedures that say we're not going to discriminate, but then in their procedures talking about particularly names and pronouns, they have the, you know, an adult, generally an adult student has, unless can I start again? So I have to remember how it goes. So basically what they say is that if a young person doesn't have the permission, or the school doesn't have the permission of a parent to use the name and pronoun of a student, the school district isn't going to honor the student's request for that. And so that's written to school procedure. And I'm like, one, that treats transgender students differently, because we're not asking our the parents of cisgender students, can we call your cisgender student a nickname or a name that's different than what happens to be on their birth certificate. But we have this, it's kind of diffuse throughout Wisconsin, particularly because there's no statewide guidance. So we have all these school districts coming up with these different procedures, and that's one that keeps coming up. And I would think that the decision from the 7th Circuit Court would say, that's not okay, that's discrimination. But like, how do, like if you're, like, so what advice might you give to folks that might be in school districts that actually have that in their, written into their procedures? Does that make sense as a question? So,
yeah.
Pause.
It definitely makes sense as a question, you know, I think that approach is just wrong. That by refusing to call a trans student by their chosen name, you are, every time you use that name, singling that person, that kid out as transgender, as different, as somehow less worthy of, you know, respect than his or her classmates. And it's a constant reminder to them and to all their classmates and to anyone who's listening that we're calling out your trans status to the whole class, because, you know, one of the markers of what it means to be, you know, to be trans is to have your, you know, name align with your gender identity. And if it doesn't, that's sort of in the same way that making Ash use a bathroom behind lock and key or travel 10 minutes through the school, you know, missing all this class time, was sort of calling attention to himself. Anything where you're using the wrong name or the wrong pronouns does the same thing. And I think that if that question were to be litigated in court, Whitaker would, you know, definitely govern that. I would also say, you know, we made the case to the court in part by showing the examples of how school districts in Wisconsin and around the country have already done this easily for many years, right? And we put in like declarations from the principal and superintendent at Shorewood who said, yeah, we adopted a trans-inclusive policy a couple years ago. We were really nervous. We didn't know what was gonna happen. Nothing happened, right? It ended up being just a positive thing for our school and our community, and the sky didn't fall. We shared stories from California where every school district in California is required by state law to you know, treat trans kids properly. And there was a brief that was submitted in Ash's case to the appeals court from school administrators in 21 states saying, we combined represent, you know, millions and millions of students who go to school with trans kids in schools that have trans-inclusive policies, and hey, it works, right? That you don't have to overthink this, and I think that really is the issue.
So in other words,
Really
oh
quick,
yeah, go ahead.
I also want to cut in that policies, like you said, the one that is here in Janesville and other districts
in many
across the
districts,
state,
yep.
I think it's also particularly harmful just because it treats trans students like pets. Like, you have to ask to call them things. It's like, well, that's their name. Those are their pronouns. That's their decision. And I think, you know, using the parental consent on things that are medical makes more sense. But in terms of name and how you present, that's all your own bodily autonomy. And I think that, just to put it out there, like, I think that's very invalidating of, you know, people's right to choose their own path, their own name, their own identity.
Yeah.
And Brian, I'll just leave it on. I'll add that, you know, one thing to that is that there's a difference between your official school records, which only, you know, a few people see,
right,
and what your attendance roster looks like, or what the teacher calls you in class, right? So if I wanted to be called Joey, I don't, but like if I did, I would, you know, the teacher did when I was in elementary school call me Joey, and that was, you know, that was it, right? Even though my, you know, official school records will have my full name. But no one's getting called by their full name, you know, unless they want to, you know, and that's just par for the course. So you really are treating trans kids differently by adding this layer of, you know, for the informal stuff, for the day-to-day interactions in class, you know, with other students in the room and things like that. It really is a privacy problem for the trans students.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And two things I take from that. One is, if anybody wants to pursue something, they should give Joe a call. So, or talk to gsafe, and we'll provide some. I'm giving you a hard time, Joe. And because I'm having a middle-aged moment, I forgot the other thing that I was going to say. I'm just going to own that in front of everybody. The other thing I was going to say is that the thing that I also recognize is that again, because there's no statewide, we have no statewide guidance. it's really been left up to individual school districts or organizations supporting school districts. So I think particularly school districts that work with the Wisconsin Association of School Boards, I know that their guide model procedures has that like really excellent piece that says you have to ask for parental permission before. So that's that I think gsafe, as well as other folks, asking the Wisconsin Association of School Boards to say, hey, we need to change that policy because it's bad policy and it's discriminating against trans students. I think that's an action step that I would love to invite all of you to consider doing. Because me, as gsafe, reaching out, even though I think I have magical powers, they don't always listen or don't have the capacity to listen, but I think a lot of folks from around the state reaching out and asking, saying they need to reevaluate that guidance can be really helpful. So I actually want to throw out, and I don't have, could I get a volunteer? Like I thought I saw Daisy. Daisy, would you mind if people have questions, grabbing the mic, because I think I have one. I see a hand over there. I see one right there, so.
Hello. Can you talk about the law in Wisconsin? I don't know what other states do around trans participation in sports, especially in high school.
Oh yeah, so last year I had a big problem with the WIA not allowing me to participate in track, and I just kind of gave up on it, to be honest. They didn't really help at all, and they all just sent me the same like copy and paste of that. They formed their rules off of like Olympic and NCAA policies that are like inherently discriminatory against trans folks. If you wanted to, I guess you could like take it to court, but they're all about trans women, not about trans men, like participating in sports. So yeah.
Were you able to add to that? Or
Yeah, so when I was in high school, when I was in high school, I played tennis. They would have had zero problem with me going from female tennis to male tennis. And they're like, oh, well, it's about strength level and hormones, and it doesn't really matter if you're taking testosterone or not. But in Wisconsin, I believe, trans female athletes are not allowed to compete until they've been on like a year of hormones or something. And
And they also, you have to have a doctor's note, a therapist note, and a school counselor note. So like,
I had to have a doctor's note and a therapist note to transfer over, which I didn't end up transferring over, but microphone. Is that better?
Yep.
Sorry, I tried. So I was also required to have a doctor's note and a therapist's note. But the therapist's note, at least with some hospitals in Wisconsin, is required to get hormone therapy. So like, a lot of the things overlayer, but they still require those things.
Yeah, so so Wisconsin Interscholastic Athletic Association has a policy that says we don't discriminate, and then it discriminates, particularly against trans girls. So, and basically they make the argument that they're making is that, you're not really a girl unless you've been on hormones for whatever. And the reality is that all bodies are different, all people are different, and they don't get to make the decision about who's a girl, who's not a girl, et cetera, et cetera. But yet, that's still the policy that dictates Wisconsin. So, like with the Wisconsin Association of School Boards, I would invite folks to join gsafe in asking WIA or letting WIA know that their policy that says it doesn't discriminate still actually discriminates. So, were there other questions? Sorry, Joe.
So this is a legal question. Since our law protecting our students is precedent, like I've written cases, it happens to go back to Supreme Court and it's decided against them, does that invalidate the circuit law that's here?
It would, yeah. So there are actually several cases that have gotten their way up to the Supreme Court. They're all employment discrimination cases, but one is a trans discrimination case and a couple are sexual orientation. And the court keeps punting them forward. They haven't taken them yet, but if they took any one of those cases and ruled the wrong way, the landscape could look very different because whatever the Supreme Court does binds every lower court, including the circuit courts. So we'd have to wait and see, but it definitely could change.
So would it be in our best interest to get our legislatures to actually put something on the books?
Yes.
Yeah. And Daisy, let's take, I think we can do one, maybe two more questions.
What kind of advice would you give kids around the middle school and high school level to try to make more inclusive bathrooms and changing rooms in their school?
So what I would say is sometimes the best thing you can do, so slight diversion. When I went to Madison, they had this whole module on how you can intervene in cases of people being preyed on sexually, and I think some of those things you can apply to protecting trans peers in restrooms and locker rooms. You can, if they're in a conflict or someone's, confronting them, you can directly intervene of okay, no, you're canceled, we're going, sort of thing, we're out of here. You can say, oh my gosh, Jesse, our friend needs us, we gotta go. A diversion, distraction, intervention. Getting an adult that you trust is also something that works. Some of these confrontations can be very scary, and I also say that from personal experience, and having someone advocate for you when you're afraid to is really, really powerful, and it means the world when people say something, because it's almost always trans people having to advocate for themselves, people obligating them to educate them because they're I don't understand, and it's not a trans person's obligation to educate every single person. It's not a trans person's obligation to have to explain why they're in a bathroom all the time. I'm not there to talk to people. Please stop talking to me. Yeah, thank you.
So I'll just add one thing to that, and it refers back to what the federal guidance was and what's in a lot of the model policies that a lot of organizations have advocated and school districts have adopted, which is anytime you're putting the burden on the trans student to bear the weight of any privacy concerns, you're doing the wrong thing. That privacy concerns for everybody are legitimate, right? We're not discounting that some people have different levels of comfort and bodily privacy, and in any shared space, whether you're trans or cis or and so the best practice is to find ways to enhance privacy for all students. And if there are students uncomfortable using shared spaces, to create single-use spaces for anyone who wants to use them without giving a reason, right? Without just singling out the one kid, and usually it's always the trans kid that gets singled out and nobody else. So, thinking through that lens of how can we, not put the burden on the trans kid every time, and make it a better environment for all students is the way you're going to make a lot of progress, I think, in having more inclusive environments.
Absolutely, and it also makes me think one of the things that we've had some school districts reach out to us recently, they're in a position where they can either build new school buildings or renovate the spaces that they have, and there's been some really great things done in Minnesota, particularly the St. Paul School District, where they have some really great strategies to do some more universal design so that it's more accommodating for all students. And something that's really interesting, of course, because Wisconsin, we've run into some building codes that the schools are being told, oh, we can't do these things that are actually better for everybody because of current building codes. So that's another challenge that we have. So there's oftentimes these layers and layers upon challenges. I really appreciate the two of you taking time to share your story, share your expertise and wisdom. I'm wondering if if the two of you had last thoughts or last comments or last suggestions before we wrap up.
No, thanks. It was just a real pleasure to be here, and thanks for all the work that you're doing here in Wisconsin to make schools safer and more inclusive for LGBT kids. It's really, really important.
Cool, thank you. So we're going to give them an applause in just a moment, but not yet. Hang tight, we have just a couple other things before we release you for lunch, so don't run out quite yet. But now we can give them love and appreciation, so let's do it.
My name's Ali Muldrow. I'm the co-director of the Gay Straight Alliance for Safe Schools, gsafe. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I am really proud to get to introduce Jodi Patterson, who is the author of The Bold World, a book that I am currently reading. So this book, it's a really, really gorgeous book. Janet Mock said, in her stunning and moving debut, a courageous and poetic testimony on family and the self, and the learning and unlearning we must do for those we love. Jodi Patterson offers us all a blueprint to what it means to be a champion for our children, and encourages us to be bold enough to let our babies lead the way, especially when we don't have the answers. This is required reading for every parent and anyone who has ever been parented. Any parents in the house? I love teachers because you are like, we're gonna raise our hands. We're gonna indicate that yes, we are in fact parents, and we're gonna do so politely. So this is an incredible book. Without further ado, please, a warm welcome for Jodi Patterson.
Hello, how are you? Thank you for having me. How's the sound? Are we good? So I am really, really proud to be here. My life took a turn that I would have never expected. And I want to share, and it brought me here. But I want to share my family story with you because I want you to see how we've been flexible around ideas around gender. And it wasn't easy, but I want to walk you through what it felt like for me. So I've always been told that women are powerful, tenacious, and important, that we pull from limitless places, that we make magic wherever we go. I believed that beneath moments of weakness, there were these endless reserves of strength. I probably don't need to tell you that I was raised by Black Southern women. But just a few years ago, I was feeling none of those powers. A friend of mine once told me that the job of a parent is to bring endless optimism to our children, and particularly mothers, he said, should always be optimistic. That's goals, but at the time in my life, about 8 years ago, I was only feeling pessimism. It had become clear to me that women do in fact break. I was 43 years old. I was run ragged by the expectations of my life. Most nights I wasn't sleeping. I was kept up at night thinking about what the next day would bring, thoughts of what I knew the next day would bring. And with my grown-up life in full swing, there was really never much time to pause. And I counted this out recently. In 25 years, I had done 17 homes, 2 husbands, 5 children, 9 careers, and countless friendships. And like many of us here, I had this sort of grinding 60-hour work week that just did not stop. And I wasn't stopping. I just set a goal, and I just kept going until I hit the target. The bullet hit the target. So Penelope, my 3rd child, was the straw that broke the camel's back. Right? It was all going smoothly until Penelope, the disruptor, came in. I want to give you some perspective on this. So I come from a line of women that do things differently. My grandmother married 5 times. One man she married twice. She's phenomenal, Dr. Gloria Blackwell. She sued school boards and hospitals and won during the segregated South. She was jailed dozens of times. They called her a communist. She had her master's and her PhD at a time when America wasn't even sure she should be in school. My mother, Jamel, went to the University of Strasbourg, went to Harvard and Wesleyan. She studied French, and she went on to found a school in Harlem for Black families, a private school called the Patterson School. My Aunt Lerma, very beautiful, uninterested in being pretty, she decided for love without legalities. She ended up having a long-lasting relationship with Gil Scott-Heron, who is a revolutionary singer who wrote "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." And she wanted a child without a husband, and she wanted love without legalities. So I come from a long line of women who do things differently. My own strange life wasn't so strange to me. I learned self-determination from my great-great-grandmother, and she passed it down to all of us. And I was thinking I was going to pass it to all of my daughters, right, raising all these strong feminists. 3 generations later, Penelope was born. My third child, who within the first year was showing signs of stress. So reoccurring nightmares, bedwetting, nail biting. By the second, third year, most days were filled with fights. Penelope became a bully at home. Penelope became a bully at the playground. And everything was protest. No to changing diapers. No to getting dressed. No to brushing hair. Smacking toothbrushes out of my hand. Stomping on diapers. I wasn't paying attention. The toothbrushes had princesses on them, and the diapers had butterflies on them. I wasn't paying attention. But I was trying to figure out what could be wrong with my child. We have everything. We have a life, a house, a home, siblings, food. But Penelope became darker and darker and heavier and heavier. And I'm a mother of 5, so temper tantrums don't bother me. I can tune that out. But Penelope, what Penelope was going through was different. And so we tried as parents to do anything and everything we could. We thought, okay, so more hugs, more snuggles, longer nap time, more reading. I remember we even took out dairy from Penelope's diet. We're like, maybe it's a dairy allergy. But like all of the, as a parent, you think of all of the things that the surrounding circumstances and the environment that maybe if you just adjust this and adjust that, I thought Penelope's attitude would change. And so we did things. They weren't enough. Cutting the hair into a mohawk did something. Wearing jeans did something, but they weren't really getting at the root of the issue. One day after, it was a summer, and one day I remember Penelope had done like 1,000 outbursts. And I just had enough, and so I picked Penelope up and we walked into Penelope's room and we sat on the floor together. And it was, when do you have that moment with your kid, when you sit down quietly together? And I asked Penelope for the first time, what's wrong? Why are you so angry? And I hadn't done that before. I was trying to move things around and adjust, but I this time asked Penelope, why are you so angry? And Penelope said, almost like, thank you for asking. The tears just started flooding down. And Penelope said, well, because everyone thinks I'm a girl, and I'm not. So my head starts spinning. I'm thinking, Penelope's 3. And I'm trying to find something to relate to. And I want to show support. So I say, oh, yeah, I get it. Penelope is noticing the way in which this world oftentimes works in the favor of men. Penelope at 3 understands sexism. Penelope is choosing between tough boy, weak girl, right? So I was in support. I said, however you feel is fine. If you want to act like your brothers, go ahead. Act like a boy. And Penelope said, no, Mama, I don't feel like a boy. I am a boy. So I was like, okay, what is going on is much more than I know. I don't know what this is. And they shocked me, those words, because I thought I had failed Penelope. I thought I had failed to raise a feminist. Again, Penelope was only 3, but that was around the time when my parents and my mother were teaching me about Shirley Chisholm, Billie Jean King, Nina Simone, Maya Angelou, Toni Morrison. These women who've changed the world for the better. And so I thought, oh, shoot, I dropped the ball on feminism. I forgot to make this girl proud to be who she is. And I was feeling a lot of guilt as a mother. Penelope's different. He likes karate, baggy jeans, high tops, math, science, getting straight A's. He likes his full name, Penelope. Now, these things aren't specific to one gender, we know, but these are the things he likes, and he's told me so. And of course, as a mother, I tried to still, even after that conversation, and before that conversation in the bedroom, I tried to make Penelope into the girl that I thought Penelope should be: smart, witty, beautiful. Words like sassy, those words that I was using to describe Penelope. I tried hard for years, 3 years, and that just made Penelope sad. And then it really made me sad too. Part of my fear was that I understand this world to be different to those who are different and to be mean to those who are different. And I looked and I thought about the stories that I knew around gender nonconforming. I remember Paris is Burning. And it's, I don't know, by show of hands, do you remember that documentary? So it's a documentary set in New York City about kids, teenagers who are gender nonconforming. And many of them died. Beautiful documentary, sad endings. And I thought, this is what we're up against. I also thought about Silence of the Lambs, where there's the psychopath dancing in front of the mirror. Because of the way it had been presented to me, I thought that was what transgender or gender nonconforming meant. I thought those stories, those two specific stories, were what was my future, what my future looked like with Penelope. And I say very clearly now, I thought that America, which has been divided on race and class and love for so many years, I thought that same America would be divided on my Penelope. I thought that was this country wouldn't stand with Penelope or for Penelope. I still feel that way sometimes. Over the past 8 years, I've had to reimagine my daughter as my son. I've had to wrap my head around Penelope as he, and I've had to just simply let Penelope be boy, allowing him space to travel into spaces that weren't allowed for him as girl Penelope, right? And, you know, although we know we're not supposed to raise our children with bias, we do. So the way we speak to boys, and I found this out because I was watching myself. As soon as Penelope said, I am a boy, I started watching myself. And I saw how we speak kindly, sweetly to girls and sternly to boys. At least I was. I was also speaking like this to my husband, you know, very sternly. Because I thought that's what, I thought Mars and Venus, right? So we put pink butterflies on girls' diapers and we put superheroes on boys. We let our boys fall down, get dirty, experience life, come up swinging, and oftentimes we protect our girls from rape culture and mean people and bad things, right? It's just there's a dynamic between how, there's a difference between how we raise boys and how we raise girls, and I was watching that in myself. More background on me. I was born in the 70s and I grew up in New York City. My father's from Harlem, and he decided that he wanted to raise his daughters, he has 4 daughters, to be very proud of who we are. So pretty much anything we wanted to do, as long as it didn't interfere with his space, we could do. So for example, if we wanted to wear jeans, dirty blue jeans under our dresses, and my mom would frown, my dad would say, who cares what they look like? They're happy. And if we didn't want to brush our hair, he would challenge us to afro contests. Who could grow the most unruly afro by Easter? So everything was about challenging and redefining. He said, we're not alive to be pretty. We're alive to reimagine, to dream forward, and to challenge the status quo. That was his perspective pretty much on everything in life. So here I am today at almost 50, and I am asked to reimagine in the most critical way yet. I need to reimagine new space for my son Penelope in this world where that space is not given to him. As adults, half the time we already know what the answer is. We know the route on the subway. We know the difficult person at work, the coworker. We know when people go low, we go high. All of these things are tricky, arduous tasks that we do every day, but they're not surprising, right? And if we don't know exactly the answer, we have a picture of what the answer looks like. But when Penelope said, I am a boy, I didn't have anything for that. It kind of bounced around in my head, and I didn't have an appropriate response. So I really just listened to him. And in that, there was an obvious gap between where I was and where he was, and I honored that gap. I just let that gap be because I didn't want to close it up with answers or assumptions or anything really, because I didn't feel like I had anything to give him at the moment. And he said what he said to me when he revealed who he is, they were clear. The words were clear. At 3, he said, I love you, but I don't want to be you, Mama. I want to be Papa. I want a peanut. I want the doctors to make me a peanut. I don't want tomorrow to come because tomorrow I'll look like you. And I sat on those words for about a year because I thought no one would really understand what they wouldn't believe me, number one. I wanted to protect Penelope's space. I wanted to protect those words, and I wanted time to figure out what was going on. I was still in that fixing mode, but I honored those words and let them sit for a while. Sometimes that space that we want to close up with answers needs to be honored. Now, years later, I understand Penelope to be transgender. I no longer want to change him. I want to change the world. I want to change myself and the way in which I interact with people. So I want to expand my friend group, one of the reasons why I'm here today. When I look out, you don't look like me, not most of you. And I did this test a few years back. I looked at my Facebook friends, and they all looked like me. Black, cisgender, educated, female. And I thought, this is not going to serve my family. It doesn't even make sense. How can all of my friend group look just like me? So is Penelope the only transgender person that I know? And that was shameful. And it was also just counterproductive to raising my family. So I challenged myself and I challenged my family, and I really challenge everyone in this room to take a look at your friend group. See if they look like you, just like you. If everyone in your friend group looks like you, we are not doing the work. We have to diversify. And diversifying does not just apply to the corporation or the rich white man. It applies to every one of us, because my life was not gender diverse, and so I was missing out on an understanding. So that's the one thing I do, is I diversify my friend group. But even the businesses I work with, I try to spend my money differently and support organizations that are LGBTQAI friendly and supportive. So this is a little side story, and I share it because I feel like maybe you'll be kind to me and laugh. But at one point, it was New Year's Eve, and I looked at my family and I said, it cannot be that Penelope, our own child, is the only trans person we know. So this year, and I was like, this year we are going to find new friends, and they all have to be gender nonconforming. Every single one of them. And my daughter was like, it's weird, I don't like the way that sounds, it's not making me comfortable, I think it's awkward, Mom. And I said, well, yeah, it is awkward, and we have to take these awkward steps, and they have to be intentional. And I might sound like, I might sound funny, but it's not a funny situation. We really have to take that first step, because if you're looking in your own group, you will find, your own Facebook friends. So I set the bar high for my family, and since then we go to a sleepaway camp as a family for families with gender nonconforming children. So you have grandmothers and parents and siblings and husbands and wives, and someone within the family, and maybe multiple people within the family, are gender nonconforming, and we spend weeks together. Many of them are my good friends now. Instead of shifting my kid, I wanted to seismically shift my brain and the bias that I was holding. As parents, as professionals, we need to flip it upside down, if that's what it takes. Be awkward, make those sort of drastic changes, because we're missing out on some information here. We're only seeing a little bit of it, or at least I was. I tell you this story because it feels like to me the story of trans people is shaping up to be the story of Black people, Jewish people, marginalized people. All marginalized groups around the world have folks trying to rewrite the story to serve their own needs. And so I see Penelope, I see people trying to rewrite Penelope all the time. And so I'm looking at, and I'm not comparing a Black person to a trans person, I'm comparing oppression. And I see the link. I was reading James Baldwin's book, The Fire Next Time, and it's about his time growing up in America when America was blatantly racist. And I did this example. I just placed, wherever he said Negro, I placed trans. And again, I was not trying to compare Baldwin's life to Penelope's life. I was trying to compare oppression in the 60s to oppression today. Bias then to bias now. And it smells the same. It feels the same. So we have to realize that what we're doing now is not new. We are trying to rewrite certain people who we're trying to actually erase certain people. America does that, and it has been doing it. I see it, and one day I was sitting at the dinner table, and I have 5 children, all my children were sitting, and I thought, this is just unacceptable. There are 2 Americas at my table. There's one for my cis kids and one for my trans kid at my own dinner table. So and that affects all of us, because we're talking, of out trans folks in America, a couple of million people. And so you don't have to know statistics, but cause and effect. If a few million of us are living in a hostile environment, then we'll all feel that hostility. It's just, there is no other. There is no over there. It really is here that we're talking about. So when I was giving Penelope permission to be himself from the inside out, I was also giving that permission to myself and to all of my children. And that's where it gets tricky, because once as a mother, you give permission to one person to be exactly who he is, despite the odds, all of the other kids are like, wait, hold up, are you listening? Because I have something too that I need specifically, cared for. So it does get tricky as a parent or as a provider. But really the domino effect is not that Penelope hasn't influenced his brothers to become trans. I haven't convinced anyone of anything in my family. But what it does is we allow for the individual to feel comfortable and to feel safe to say, I have something special, I have something different. One of my kids, his different thing is he's a scientist. And he holds me to it just the same way that Penelope holds me to LGBT, the community of the LGBT community. So Cassius says, we need to become a part of the science community. And so I've established this thing in my house called the lab, because we don't all agree, right? So I have this subversive way of parenting, and whenever we don't agree on something, it could be who gets the front seat of the car, it could be gender, it could be race, it could be religion. We sit down face to face, like on the floor, and each person has the microphone, the proverbial microphone. You can take as long as you want to speak. If it takes 10 minutes to get your point across, you got that microphone. And the rules are you can't interrupt. Then the next person goes, right? I have 5 kids. So Cassius will start by saying, I respect my brother. I will always use the right pronouns. Penelope can do anything in the world he wants to, but biologically speaking, in fact, physiologically speaking, we have to understand that this is a physical girl. This is a female anatomy. This body is female, therefore Penelope, scientifically speaking, is female. And he's like, I just want to put that on the record, I just want to put that on the table. And so Penelope waits, and when it's his turn, he says, look, first of all, everything isn't so science-y all the time, and I am the way God made me. Just a fact, it's not an opinion. I am here, I exist, I am trans, and I am the way God made me. And then science kid, Cassius says, well, God is not proven either. So you've lost me on God, you've lost me on gender. I need, Petri dish proof. So this has been going on for years. Cassius in his 13-year-old science mind, and I want to tell him there is science to show gender diversity. But he's 13. I know if you cannot slam up anyone against. So he's coming from his limited science mind of a 13-year-old, and Penelope is coming from his lived experience as a trans person. They've been having this conversation in my lab for years. They are no closer. They're like on the opposite ends. They have not gotten any closer to agreeing. And my opinion is the goal is not to agree. That has not been my goal. My house is a little microcosm of the world. The goal is not to agree. But what's interesting is after Penelope does 10 minutes and Cassius does 10, and then Othello does 10, and then Georgia does 10, and then Air 9 does 10, they go, you know what? Does anyone want to just go play basketball? Does anyone want to just eat dinner? So we've been eating dinner at the same dinner table. They've been using the same bathrooms. They've been sleeping in the same bedrooms. So at one point in my life, if I hadn't had Cassius, I would have thought the people out there talking about, disproving Penelope because of science or through science, I would have hated them. I have a person in my house who resembles in some way that lack of information. And so I have developed this thought that if we can disagree and discuss and debate with decorum and respect, then that to me is the most important thing. And I'm trying to raise my children with that ability. The culture that I'm interested in now, cultivating, isn't one of surface anything, not surface beauty, not surface thought. It's one of depth and of purpose, of training the mind to listen, observe, absorb, and expand. My grandmother used to make us, my southern grandmother used to make us brush our hair every night, 100 times before going to bed. 100 times. And the idea, she said, was that nothing grows unless you nurture the roots. Nothing. It always starts from the roots. So I have this mantra that I give my kids: we are strong, we are wise, we are capable. So I know it's not the most revelatory of messages, but it's something that keeps us going. It's something that I go back to all the time. And so it needs to be our mission to steadily undo all the stereotypes we've learned about ourselves and all the stories that tell us who we're supposed to be and what we're expected to do. Let's dismantle any notion of an ideal woman, boy, girl, human, man, husband, wife. Let's toss that out. We have to mantra what we want to become. So all day I was like, Penelope, he. Penelope, he. Penelope, he. I had to train my mind and train my tongue. And so now I'm like award-winning author, award-winning author. We really have to mantra what we want to become because it's not easy to reimagine, especially if you haven't seen it before. Right? It's easier if you have a visual, but oftentimes, Penelope, what visual did he have of himself? So I had to think about how do we reimagine? How do we dream forward? Because we're talking about dreaming forward, reimagining a career, reimagining an identity, reimagining gender. In my case, I had to rethink it. So breaking out of any confine requires an effort. And the way I look at it is, it really comes down to mental flexibility and dexterity. So let me break it down. This is how I look at it. Not everyone sort of sees, probably not in this room. We don't have the same opinion on what I'm saying. But the more we lab it out, the more we put our ideas on the table and see where they go, then these big ideas won't be foreign to us. And the idea of the other person over there won't really exist. And that's really, for me, the goal. Okay, so here's where it gets interactive. I want you to substitute Penelope's name for your name. Imagine that you are Penelope. Penelope, insert your name, is what we wholeheartedly need to protect. Penelope doesn't live in the hair or in the clothing or in a meeting. We don't live in a title or a job or an expectation. Penelope doesn't even live in feminism. We are more than one thing. We are spirit. We are non-binary. It's simple. The trees can't be described as either short or tall. The ocean can't be described as either cold or warm. Birds aren't fluffy or sleek. So nothing in nature is one of two choices. And so to think that the human experience has defied all of nature and is only one of two, I question that. As a woman, I've been pulled in so many directions. I've been pulled by children, by husbands, morals, by love, loss, by ideas, places. That constant tug has made me the woman I am, but it also has pulled me from my spirit many times. And so when I saw Penelope in that moment being detached from his spirit, I really related to that. So important to return daily to your spirit. And so I do this thing, I like to surprise my kids. Sometimes I'll just, be the first person to jump into the ocean. Sometimes I will dance in the house. And these small things shock my children. They're like, oh my God, Mom's going crazy. Right, and it's like, because most of the time they see me working or writing or organizing or homework but sometimes I'll just do something that surprises them. Like does anyone know what Packers are? So Packers are, and crudely speaking, they're just prosthetic penises that you can use in your underwear to create the look of a penis. And so I bought them at a conference like this. We had them, and I bought them for my family because I thought, well, one, it's a good way to understand anatomy, and two, it's a good way to put this this thing that many people use in front of my children to see. So I brought it, I put it on the table, I told them I'd give them $5 if they wrote a paper on the anatomy of a penis. And they liked that. But then I also talked to them about what a packer is. They were like, what is Mama doing? This was shocking to them. And it was, if my mother had seen it, it would be shocking to her as well. But we have to be progressive, and it's not even progressive. It feels progressive to us old folks, right? A month later, my daughter, who's 19, came into my bedroom and said, Mom, I have to talk to you, something really bad, something really important. And I thought, she's pregnant. Gosh. Because that's where, that's like where my mind was. And she goes, I have to talk to you about my identity. I'm genderqueer. So I put a smile on my face, and I said, well, tell me what that means. She said, well, sometimes I see myself as male, sometimes I see myself as female. I present both ways. And she goes, and Mama, sometimes, and I don't want to shock you, I think about using a packer. I said, oh, top drawer left, 2 different sizes. Choose. And she was like, what, Mama? And I said, I'm ready for you. Like, we have to try to be there, and we have to go in the direction that feels awkward at 50. That was, a big coup on my end. Recently, I've been reimagining myself as king, not king over this or that, not king over my children, but king of this, right? I own this. And so I tell my children, I'm king. And they say, no, Mama, you're queen. Girls are queens. Boys are kings. I said, no, I'm king. Mama, you cannot be king. You have to be queen. I said, no, well, you're going to sit on that. You're going to sit with the idea that I am king. Not over you, but over me. That word I'm using. Come back to me in a few years. We have to push things. We have to change language. I also tell them about starfish. And I say it as an activity. I said, it's time to starfish, which means stretch out. Touch all things in life. Not just those things that are boys, or those things that are for girls, or those things that are for mamas. But we need to be touching all aspects of life. And if something is severed from trauma, then it grows back. It's all about regrowth. So I play around with words for my children. All of us can reimagine. We can be more than what our gender says, more than what society tells us we should be. If we write ourselves off as purely one thing, women do this or men do that, we will gravely underestimate our infinite potential. The life I want for myself and all of my children and everyone in this world, in this room, is not something to be stuck up under. This life must be traversed. It must be touched and experienced. So I push us today to reimagine ourselves in ways that no one else would ever think to suggest. A new gig, a new love, a new home, a new career, a new language, a new community, a new identity, a 3rd, 4th, and 5th marriage, if it so pleases you. Thank you.
So we're going to take a few questions for the next 7 minutes, and I will start us out, and then we will pass the mic. So if you're thinking of a question, you've got a question burning inside of you, we will be able to have that question answered.
Hello. You got the first one.
To talk to you from over there. But I think one of the things that stood out to me in reading the book was this space that you go back to throughout the book of trying to fix, change, resolve, and that being your initial process, and then that also being the process of your family and extended family. So particularly, one of the places that I found to be strikingly emotionally interesting was your mom contacting you to say, maybe it was the thing with the urinary tract infection and the catheter, and look into that. And what allowed you to move beyond that space of fixing or changing or searching for the origin? And how were you able to communicate? How do you communicate that to people in an ongoing way?
So I think what happens is we just do the things that work until they don't work. So everything made sense until, I saw Penelope just slipping away. And so, first goal is to save, for many years, my whole focus was save Penelope. And that ended up taking most of my time, because time is finite. And so my energy was spent saving Penelope, which means that I wasn't there for my other children with the same intensity. But I think the goal is life, right? So that was really, I was trying to save life. The automatic thing to do for me is to do something. I'm always in motion, I always want to do. Still today, I have to remind myself to stop. So I was constantly looking for a way out, because I felt like we were just sinking. So I was trying to find my way out, clawing for something to make it better. And you do that for a couple of years, and you just wear yourself down. So I probably, if I could have continued to do that, I probably would have been on that sort of mentality of fix it, you can do it, you're a woman, you're black, you've got this, like nothing is gonna stop, and then the body just starts to fall apart. So I think it was just, I hit a wall with the regular way I approached life. If I hadn't hit that wall, I would have continued that way. But the wall stopped me, and I went back down south. And the book is really me trying to not understand Penelope's transition, but to look at my transition. So I wanted to leave Penelope alone. I wanted the world to leave Penelope alone. I wanted Penelope to just be who he is. And he chooses to keep his name, Penelope. He says, why would I want to change my name? I love my grandmother. I'm sticking with my name. So really, when I started seeing him, I started thinking, let me just move stuff out of the way, because it was confusing. So it was out of desperation that I was trying to fix it, but there was also out of necessity that I just stopped. When I went back down south, just sitting and looking at pictures, I did like hours and hours of contemplating who the women were that came before in my family. I think we don't do that enough. We always think, okay, this is a new situation, this is a new kid, this is a new era, we have to come with a new approach. This is all a very new and confusing time. But if we stop and look back at things, and look back at history, and look back at our family, or people in our families that are revolutionaries, if you don't have any, you can borrow some of mine. I don't have a lot of revolutionaries in my family. But we need to look at them and think, how did they do it? How did they come out of something? How did folks with very little come up against an entire system? And so that was what helped me realize that it wasn't so much about fixing Penelope, it was really more about allowing my brain to see that life is different than I ever imagined.
Yeah, I think that's demonstrated in what I consider to be just really beautiful writing of when you're trying to fix or solve or trace back to what went wrong. All of that becomes this kind of barrier to seeing Penelope. And as that falls away, Penelope becomes recognizable in who he is, and it's a really beautifully written thing. But one of the other things I really loved about what you wrote was that it was as much about you as being a parent as it was about you being someone who was parented. And I think that is a line we struggle to see ourselves on. And so in seeing that and seeing the complexity of you as a person who is now raising people and existing in a really expansive way throughout the book, how do you navigate that balance? And very specifically, how do you navigate that balance in the context of race and gender?
I have this funny, there were many parts of the book that I contemplated not sharing. Like, there were many pieces to my story that I didn't want to put in the book, because I thought they're just too complex, they're too hard for the reader to get past. And some of them I pulled out, and some of them I actually put in. So there's talking about being parented and how that affects us. So I graduated from Spelman College, which is in Atlanta, and I had gone into publishing. I was a junior editor, and I still wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I took a year. I finally knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to go to grad school. I wanted to study literature. And I thought I needed my dad to help me pay for school. So I went to him and I sat him down and I gave him this long pitch, like, you've gone to grad school, you know how valuable it is, I'd like to do the same. Would you please, I have this dream of being a writer, but I want to go to grad school for literature. Would you please help me? And before I could get out, like, could you pay for the, he said, do whatever you want in this world. Do whatever you want, but I'm not paying for grad school. Because grad school is for fat, gay, ugly women. Yeah, exactly. Right. And so, you know, at the time, and this is my father, whom I love. He's one of the most dominant figures in my life. And in that moment, I was just a young adult, but first thing that went into my mind was, first of all, how do you get to define what gay, fat, and ugly is? What if I am gay? Right? What is fat? What is ugly? I literally remember thinking, he has defined these 3 words, and he's telling them to me as if they are fact. I also thought, here's a man who has been parented with a certain lens. He's trying to parent me with that same lens. There is so much sexism. There's so much tied to the era that he grew up in. He said, you're such a beautiful girl. I love your beautiful brown skin. You should marry well with that skin. And he thought it was a compliment. You know, he thought it was a compliment. And his thought was, you are smart, but your end game is family. As a woman, you want to have a strong family. And I thought, well, I do want that, but I also want other things too. Am I distilled down to my skin color? Even though he was trying to throw me a compliment. So, you know, those moments never left my brain of when there's a certain point where people will define you, even people you love. They will try to define you because they're coming from where they come from, their perspective. And so I held on to that, and I remembered, I wanted to remind myself, don't be that parent who makes these grand assumptions on our children. And so when Penelope said, I have a boy, I was less reluctant to say no. I was more interested in saying yes, even though I didn't know what yes meant. Like, I wanted my dad to say yes. I wanted him to say, oh, go to grad school. I think it's strange that a pretty girl would want to go, but go. Right? And so I felt that way for Penelope. I thought it was strange that here's Penelope saying, I am a boy. But okay, let me be with you on this moment, on this path. It's a roundabout answer.
That's a great answer. I am going to open it up to the audience now. Are there folks who have questions? There's one. You're so far away.
So my question is, with your son identifying at such an early age and transitioning at an early age, how was your experience with the school system?
So Penel was 3 at that time, and so, you know, he walked into school, even when we were still saying she. Penel walked into school with his short hair, cut, pretty much acting the same way he's always acted, right? So the kids they understood Penelope to do and like the things that Penelope does and likes. So we attend a small school. And I use that, and it's not always the same, you know, not everyone is in a small school, but I always suggest if you can create small communities. The community is really important because the proximity that the other students had to Penelope was so important. They just knew Penelope's likes and dislikes. And so the shifting of the he-she was easier for them. A few students I'll back up a bit. The principal said yes first. I got the principal in on it. And the principal, who's a black bishop, female, her name is Bishop Silvita Gonzalez, she saw Penelope in his best form and said, I'm with you on this. So I had the backing of the top person at school, and she really set the tone. We lost 2 families, they just couldn't be around us, they couldn't take it, they left, and she said, you'll have to leave, because this is our position on gender and on children in general. We just support children. And so once that tone was set by that one leader, and sometimes you just get one, everyone else pretty much fell into shape. There were a couple of times when Penelope came home with tears because a student had said something. And so we talked about it. We decided that Penelope should go back to school and talk to the kids because these were Penelope's friends. had always been. And so Penelope said, you know, why are you angry? Why are you being mean to me? And the kid said, well, I saw you on Facebook. You were in a pink dress and pink pom-poms and you had Mary Jane's on. You're really a girl. You know, we're not going to play with you. We're not going to play with you because you're really a girl. And I saw you on Facebook in a dress. And so Penelope said, well, I don't really know Facebook because, you know, my mom doesn't let me on social media. But I'm a boy. My mom used to make mistakes. She used to put me in these dresses. And I'm a boy. The kid said, okay, why is your name Penelope? Well, I was named after my grandmother. Okay. And that was really the extent of it in our school. I know it's not, you know, it can go many different ways, but I think because we had the initial acceptance from that one leader, the tone had been set. And then what I try to encourage Penelope to do is to just call it, just to say it. Why is your name Penelope? Oh, because I was named after my grandmother. Like, he really has this ability to not defend himself, but to state himself. So school has been great. It's a small school, single bathrooms, no sports teams. But I do say that we have, so Penelope does sports. He goes outside of the school and he's on a karate team. And in karate, and I encourage this to many families that I know who have children who are young that are gender non-conforming, find a sport because that will help us understand our body. And Penelope had a lot of shame around his body and a lot of fear around his body. And so in karate, he develops a love of his body and he finds his body purposeful. So he's competing when they're young, they compete boys and girls together. As they get older, they separate the boys from the girls. And he's been, you know, he's 11 now, so 11-year-olds and 13-year-old boys spar together. And he, you know, he falls down, he gets his butt kicked, but he's won many tournaments. One year, his brother joined, and the referee was going to ask his brother to leave the tournament because he didn't have a, what is that called, like a protector, a cup. And so the judge said, all boys have to have cups, you know this, your son has to be disqualified. I said, no, there's no way, you cannot disqualify him. I've had my other son in this tournament for years, we've never worn cups. I refuse this is totally ridiculous, you can't make up these new rules. I said, Penelope has been in this contest, this tournament for years, and he's never worn a cup. I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. This is the funny thing, Penelope does not have testicles. And they were like, what? And I was like, yeah, so I was confused, you know. I just didn't realize that we needed cups. And he's like, oh, okay. And then he just let us do it. I swear it works. You just gotta state things. And people are like, oh, sometimes it works. Thank you so much, everyone.
I would encourage you all to buy the book, to read the book, to get friends together to do so. Definitely purchase it right outside of the doors. I am gonna refresh fundraising for us, but before I do that, I would like folks to stand up and give a round of applause